Okay, perfect. Doncs molt bon vespre a tothom. Good evening. Moltes gràcies per ser avui aquí i més en format online a la conferència del tinent coronel Stuart Crawford per commemorar l'aniversari recent de l'operació Desert Storm en la Primera Guerra del Golf. Welcome, Mr. Crawford, and thank you. It's such a great pleasure, as I said, to have you here this evening. And if you allow me, I'm going to introduce you in Catalan, and then I'm going to continue in English. El senyor Crawford és d'Escòcia i durant 20 anys va estar com a oficial al Royal Tanks Regiment de les Forces Armades Britàniques, retirant-se com a tinent coronel el 1999. En l'actualitat és consultor polític de seguretat i de defensa d'Edimburg, a la vegada que també és col·laborador en els mitjans i en el UK Defence Journal. Ha publicat el llibre Sending My Launch Forward, així com també ha col·laborat en l'elaboració del document Scotland's Future, que podeu trobar traduït en el web de la SEM. I'm just going to give like a very short background and like a policy context, and then Mr. Crawford can speak about his experience in the First Gulf War. So as you all know, the Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait on the 2nd of August in 1990. And it's important to know that the immediate focus of the Bush administration policy was to prevent the region's oil supplies for the industrialized economies from falling under Iraqi control. So with the invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein effectively controlled more than 20% of the world's oil reserves. And if he would have invaded Saudi Arabia, he would have controlled an additional 20%. And this is not to mention Saudi Arabia's Persian Gulf port. So to put these figures a bit into perspective, the United States at that time received probably also around 20% of its crude oil imports from the Persian Gulf, whereas Japan and Europe imported approximately 70% and 40% respectively from the region. So we can see it's quite important. It was quite important. So given the high level of international dependence on the region's oil, there was a widespread fear that Saddam would impose an economic stranglehold on the US and its allies by raising prices, leading to an inflation and perhaps also leading to an economic crisis. So as I said, the central motivation for the international community in joining the UN coalition against Iraq was to prevent Saddam Hussein from threatening and even much less controlling the supply of oil from the Persian Gulf. Of course, as you have heard and as you know, there were other political considerations which motivated the invasion, such as Kuwait's sovereignty, also to punish Iraq on the violations of international law, as well as also to demonstrate the credibility of the US commitments to its allies and friends in the Gulf region. So maybe this is more like American-centered, so I'm just gonna let Stuart Crawford speak. And yeah, it's such a great pleasure to have you here and hear like your first-hand experience on the First Gulf War. So whenever you're ready, you're more than welcome to start.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, Rosa. And just let me say how pleased I am to be invited and delighted to be able to speak to you all tonight on my very personal and, but I think, very interesting from my point of view anyway, experience of the Gulf War. And it's something which has come back up again in military circles because we are, as you know, at the 30th anniversary of that war. In fact, 30 years ago today, I was in Kuwait. So an interesting time to revisit it. What I thought I'd do, I'd start off, I've got no script, so I'm speaking not quite off the cuff, as we say, but I'm speaking freely, and I'm happy to be interrupted. And I've told Rosa to be very strict with me if she thinks I'm wandering and mithing. But very quickly, just a little bit of background, and Rosa's given you some of it already. I am Scottish. You may be able to hear that in my accent, or you may not. I don't really know, but I was born in Glasgow in central Scotland. And I spent 20 years as a regular career officer in the British Army in the 4th Royal Tanks Regiment, which was the Scottish Tank Regiment. So I served with Scottish soldiers, which was my great delight and what I always wanted to do. And I retired from the British Army in 1999 And I retired to, and I know I speak no Spanish and I speak no Catalan, many apologies for that, but I did pick up from Rosa's introduction a little bit about politics. And it's suffice to say that I retired from the British Army in 1999 to stand as a political candidate in the first Scottish parliamentary elections for the Scottish National Party. And we can come back to that if you ever want to talk about that, but that was an interesting departure. Anyway, I'd always been interested in the military, and I always wanted to be a soldier, but I don't come from a military family. My father had been a second lieutenant, which is a junior officer, at the end of the Second World War. He didn't see action in one of the Scottish infantry regiments. And my grandfather had been a volunteer in the First World War into the British Royal Army Medical Corps and had served in Italy. And a lot of people don't know there were British troops in Italy during the First World War, but they were. And he was at Caporetto, the big battle on the Isonzo in 1917. And he always said that he was the first man in the retreat. I don't know if that's true or not. But I've always had a natural interest and I always wanted to be a soldier. So just very briefly on my military career up to the Gulf War, I entered the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1980, in September 1980, in September 1979 actually. And for those of you, I mean, you may or may not know about Sandhurst, but that's basically where all British officer training takes place. And it's all conducted by non-commissioned officers, which puts the British system slightly at odds with other systems around the world. But I went to Sandhurst, and my father had gone through Sandhurst in 1946. And indeed, when I passed out of Sandhurst during the pass-off parade, he came to visit with my mother, and the parade and the music accompanying it was exactly the same as it had been 36 years before. So some things never change. Immediately after that, my regiment was in Germany. So I went out to Germany and became a troop leader, commanding 3 tanks in the Royal Tanks Regiment for a training season. And then I became the regimental signals officer. And after that, I went to the British Army Staff College. And whilst the standard course is 1 year, I did 2 years because I did technical training first, which is important to where I'm going to come back later on. And then my first staff job was in the headquarters of the Royal Armoured Corps, looking at weapons procurement, and in particular looking at the procurement of Britain's then new tank, now their current tank, the Challenger 2 tank. And again, I can talk about that because I think they bought the wrong one, but I've written about that many times. Finally, I became a squadron leader in 4th Tanks back out in Germany, where I commanded 14 Chieftain tanks and did a complete training season. So dry training on the training area in Germany, live firing at the ranges in Germany, and then out to the British Army training unit in Suffield in Canada, in Alberta, where you do live fire and maneuver, and where my command at some time was about roughly 220 men and maybe 35 to 40 armored vehicles. So that was quite big, and that is the sort of rite of passage, if you like. And following that, I became Regimental 2IC, second in command of the regiment back in Germany. So that takes me up to the Gulf War. By the time I became the Regimental 2IC, Kuwait had been invaded, and the coalition had decided that it was going to have to do something about it, and the UN resolution had been passed and all that sort of stuff. Now, it also coincided with me getting married. I got married quite late, at the age of 36. And whilst the beginnings of the build-up in Kuwait of the coalition forces started, I went off to get married, and I went on honeymoon. And because we lived in Germany at the time, and which to us is overseas, you know, the UK being an island, my then wife and I decided that we would have our honeymoon in the United Kingdom. So this we did. And as I was then going back out with my new wife to Germany, my regimental headquarters phoned me and said, could you pick something up from the Bovington camp on the way past? And I said, of course. I think it was a bit of silver for the officers' mess or something. And I said, of course, that's not a problem at all. So I popped into the headquarters in Dorset in the south of England, where I was And I met the regimental colonel, not my commanding officer, but a sort of honorary appointment who's a more sort of representational role. I picked up the silver, and then in passing, he said, "Oh, and I think you're going out to Saudi Arabia." And this was on my honeymoon. And I said, "Oh, really?" I didn't know that. Anyway, he told me I was going out to Jeddah to join the headquarters of the British Forces Middle East in Jeddah. And I was wanted, my regiment wasn't going, my battalion wasn't going, but they wanted me out of there because of my technical weapons procurement expertise, which is part of the course I did at Staff College. And at the time, the headquarters British Forces Middle East was absolutely overwhelmed with work, and it was building up to support the United Kingdom's contribution, which ended up being divisional in strength with 2 brigades. And as part and parcel of that process, the whole of every regiment in Germany, just about every armored regiment, was stripped of material for spares for the operation. So my own regiment, 4th Tanks, was rendered inoperable for spares. Every single vehicle we had was stripped of gun barrels, gearboxes, engines, wheels. And so was non-operational. And we also had sent lots and lots of volunteer soldiers out to bring other regiments up to strength. So essentially 4 weeks after my wedding day, I found myself on a plane to Saudi Arabia. And I left my wife behind in Germany, basically saying, "Please remember that they drive on the right-hand side of the road here, and here's how you get to the bank." And that was about it. And I had no idea at all when I was going to come back. Nobody knew what was going to happen. So poor her. But anyway, so there it was. And of course, I flew out with the Royal Air Force. And typically of all military deployments, in peacetime and in wartime, they never fly you at a reasonable hour, like 10:30 in the morning or 2 p.m. in the afternoon. They pick you up at 2:30 in the morning, you know, in the small hours. And so it was. And I flew out to Saudi Arabia via, I remember we'd landed to refuel in Cairo, I think, in Egypt. And it's the only time I've ever been to Egypt. And I was only there for about half an hour on the runway while the plane refueled. But because I was of that cohort, which had gone through the British Army Staff College just maybe five, maybe 6 years before, everybody that was going out to Saudi Arabia, I knew because I'd been in courses with them. They were colleagues of mine. So it was a bit of a reunion actually in slightly odd circumstances. So when I arrived, the funny thing, I'd been told I was going to Jeddah to join HQ British Forces Middle East. But HQ British Forces Middle East wasn't in Jeddah, it was in Riyadh. So that just shows you that even at that early stage, there was all sorts of confusion of where people were and who was going and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, I was met by friends when I arrived in Riyadh, and they drove me back into the city centre, where I found out that I was being billeted in the Marriott International Hotel, which came as a complete surprise because I expected to be in a sort of the usual tented camp with a central cookhouse and cold water to shave in the morning, but it ended up being in the Marriott Hotel for the duration of the war, which sounds very cushy, but in fact, it became incredibly tedious and boring after about 14 days. And sometimes I used to long to be up in the desert where the frontline troops were. However, that was not to be. The Marriott it was, and that's where I stayed. The next morning, I reported for work to the Chief of Staff, who was a full colonel. I was a major, and marched in smartly and saluted and said, you know, Major Crawford reporting for duty, sir, or something like that. And he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said, nobody told us you were coming. And I thought, right, okay. He said, "Well, I wouldn't bother unpacking because we'll probably send you up to the division." And so for 2 hours, I was kicking my heels, not unpacking until he changed his mind. And again, that just illustrates the confusion that comes in military operations because sometimes the information didn't get through to where it was meant to go. Anyway, I had arrived in the headquarters. My family thought I was in some safe, secure concrete bunker underground, but in fact I was in a completely ordinary office block, very much above ground. And in fact, the first officers who'd arrived there to set up the headquarters had been sent out to buy their own desks and filing cabinets because there was nothing there at all. So the first couple of days, the people who arrived before me had spent there, they'd been screwing together desks and chairs and filing cabinets and providing telephones and fax machines and photocopiers, which they just bought because there was no infrastructure at all. And I arrived just after that. And the other thing that I've remarked on before was that I found that we were, in addition to our salaries, and in addition to being put up in the hotel for free and fed for free for breakfast and dinner at night, we were allocated a huge amount of money for allowances, for subsistence, for meals. And I think in 1990, we were getting, on top of everything else being free and provided, we were getting £41 a day for food. And we were eating at Wendy's burger joint just over the road for about £2 a day. So everybody just saved, enormous amounts of money. And it seemed strange that in those difficult circumstances where many people were having such a terrible time because of the war, we found ourselves living in the lap of luxury and being overpaid for what it didn't last forever, but it was just one of those anomalies. And we were also issued by new cars, everything paid for by the Saudi government, of course, but we were all issued with new civilian cars. And mine was a Mazda 929, and it was delivered to me, and it had 9 miles on the clock, and it was just mine. So, I mean, the profligacy and the amount of money that was being expended by governments on this huge operation was quite mind-boggling. And in many ways, I found it quite unsettling, actually, because it seemed to me that the balance wasn't right. However, it was what it was. In terms of actual work in the headquarters, my first job was to assist a lieutenant colonel, a chap called James Short, who was from one of the British cavalry regiments, who was in charge of equipment procurement. And he was completely overwhelmed with work. So when I arrived, everything that he was doing was in his briefcase. His desk was awash with paper. There was no referencing system. There was no filing system. It was all in his head or in his briefcase. And my first job really was to bring some organization to that. So I set up the filing cabinets and all that sort of stuff and helped him with various procurement projects. There was lots of new equipment being demanded from the units in the field. And it always struck me that we'd been expected to fight the Russians for the last 10 years with what we had. But when we went to Saudi Arabia to fight the Iraqis, suddenly everybody felt that all our vehicles had to be upgraded and armored and made better. And I always thought that was a strange thing, because obviously the Russians would have been, or the Soviets would have been, a much more fearsome opponent than the Iraqis proved to be. But that's what it was. And so people were demanding all sorts of bits of equipment. I remember some strange demands, like it transpired that the motorcycles we were using in the desert, the tires were too smooth. So the demand came back and said, can we have what we call knobbly tires, ones with bumps in them that will grip in the sand? So we had to procure those, which was successful. And then because the desert was so flat, and because GPS was in its very early iteration, the artillery wanted to procure smoke rounds so that they could fire a smoke round into the desert and orientate people. And we had a 155mm gun, self-propelled guns, AS-90. And I was asked to get, well, can you get smoke rounds for them? And, how many do you need? 500, da, da, da. And the only place that we found could supply them was South Africa. Now, South Africa at that time was still under the apartheid regime, and it was a bit of an international pariah state. But that made no difference whatsoever. I said, we can get smoke rounds, we can get them from South Africa. And I was told, well, just get them then, just get them. Forget international sanctions, just get them, which I did. So it was an interesting time, but there were vast amounts of kit and equipment coming into Saudi Arabia to the theatre of operations, and but there was no asset tracking. Those were the days before the military had adopted this military equivalent of barcoding on goods. So we didn't know where anything was. And many of the containers which were shipped into theatre full of equipment were never opened. And nobody knew where anything was. And we actually lost some pretty top secret stuff for about 4 days before we found it. And it was just in a dump on the edge of an airfield somewhere, and nobody knew where it was. And one of the interesting things, just to show you the sort of chaos and confusion, is that we were never able to tell the general, or indeed our headquarters back in the UK, how many tanks we had in theatre. We were just not sure how many were there, because there was always this sneaking suspicion that one of the ships that was coming out from the UK might have had a little bit of space left on it, and someone would just stick another tank on it. And the only way we could have found out would have been to line them all up in the desert and count them, which of course was absolutely impossible. So we never knew. I mean, we thought there were 220 something, but nobody knew exactly how many there were, which seems strange nowadays, but we just didn't know. And during that build-up period, I also had my first visit up to the division in the desert to see how it was being organized. And I borrowed again a brand new Land Rover Discovery and drove up the motorway, no other traffic, up to a place called Al Jubail, which was one of the ports of entry, and the divisional headquarters was there in the sand. And I popped in, and on operations, things are completely different. You know, you pop in and you sign in with someone, and then they provide you with a bed and they feed you, and that bit works like clockwork, because there are no constraints. No one's having to register things or account for anything particular. You just do what you're meant to do. Moving on to the hostilities themselves, when it was clear that the conflict was going to break out and the whole thing was not going to pass peacefully, I moved away from equipment procurement side and moved on to the operations desk in the headquarters, in the main sort of operations cell, where I was put on the night shift, which is from 8 p.m. at night to 8 a.m. in the morning. And with my colleagues, I was on constant night shift for the next 2 months, which is quite interesting, actually. It takes you a couple of days to adjust to it, and then it becomes absolutely normal. But because such was the requirement for operational security, that I knew nothing of any of the operational plans until actually the air war started. And I only found out that the air war started when the Americans launched their cruise missiles and when the stealth fighters attacked Baghdad, et cetera, et cetera. I was outside the headquarters in the backyard where we had a catering unit set up. And so I was having my lunch, if you like, at midnight. And I always remember it was sausage and chips. I don't know, every meal seemed to be sausage and chips. But I was there with one of my chums, and we were eating our meal and just talking about it. And I said to him, there seems to be an awful lot of activity at the airport tonight. And he said, oh yes, I think something's happening. And so that's when I knew that the war had actually started and the air attacks had begun. Which was interesting, because up to that point, some of us had thought, well, you know, Saddam will back down and it's not going to happen. But we are also being careful, and I suppose it has a certain resonance with our circumstances today when we're all being vaccinated against COVID. At least I've been vaccinated. And but I was remembering just the other day that just before the air war started in Saudi, I believe Kuwait, we got our vaccinations in case the Iraqis attacked us with chemical weapons. And I think I can remember, I got vaccinations for anthrax, bubonic plague, yellow fever, and whooping cough, all on the same day at the same time. So there's this big long line of people lining up, and the medics just pump them all into you. And if you felt awful afterwards, well, tough. But and that's how it happened. So. And then the next interesting thing happened. So the air war was going on and on and on and on and on, and we were sort of monitoring it, reporting it, what we knew was happening. The Iraqi Scud raid started. And I think I recall that the first Scud missiles were fired at Israel, I think at Tel Aviv. And then they were fired at other locations. And eventually it was Riyadh's turn. And again, I was outside at midnight having my lunch of sausage and chips. And the alarm went off, and we'd heard the alarm before, so we weren't too bothered about it. And then the back door of the headquarters building opened, and one of the clerks who worked in the headquarters, in a very cheerful voice, said, "Oh, it's Riyadh tonight, chaps." And so we threw our meals away and ran around to get back into the headquarters. And as we did, the American Patriot batteries, the anti-aircraft, anti-ballistic missile batteries up at Riyadh International Air Force started firing at the incoming missile tracks. Now, there were 6 missiles fired at Riyadh that night. The American had 3 batteries of Patriot anti-ballistic missile batteries around Riyadh, but they hadn't yet set up a centralized control for fire control for those 3 batteries. And the Patriot battery is programmed to fire 2 missiles at every incoming target. So there were 6 Scuds fired at Riyadh, 3 interconnected, not connected batteries. So each of the 3 batteries fired 2 missiles at each incoming target. So there were 36 Patriot missiles fired in the space of about 30 seconds. And we were running down the road, trying to get back into the headquarters. And I can remember them shooting off into the clouds. And because they go supersonic very quickly, they go off with an enormous bang. And then when they hit the incoming, there was this huge red flash in the sky, like a lightning storm, but red. And I can remember quite distinctly looking down at the pavement, at the sidewalk, and the dust actually bounced from the reverberations on the. So that was quite exciting. We ended up having 16 Scud raids in all, and we the way I'm conscious of the time here, the way the warning system worked was that the Iraqis used to drive them out in mobile launchers into the desert from their hiding places, and raise the missiles and fire them. And the American satellites would pick up instantaneously on the infrared signature of the firing of the missiles. And within 5 seconds, all our computer screens would flash missile alert, missile alert, missile alert. And so we would know that there was an attack on. And then it would take about another 20, 30 seconds, and then it would come up and say Riyadh or Dhahran or Tel Aviv or wherever it was. So that's how we knew about them. We all had great faith in the American Patriot missile system because they told us it was 70% effective. But I think if you look into it now, you'll find out that it was more like 17% effective in those days anyway. And it was more of a morale boost than anything else. However, those were the air raids. And during the course of those, it became clear the Iraqis weren't going to leave Kuwait, and the ground war became inevitable. And I was eventually briefed on the plan, the left hook to cut off the Iraqi forces, but it was still secret. And anyway, I had a friend out in Riyadh, a civilian friend, who'd been in the regiment with me, but was now a journalist. And in fact, in the UK, he's now a very well-known journalist, a chap called Mark Urban, who presents for the BBC on Newsnight. He's their diplomatic editor. And I met him for lunch because I knew him from regimental days. And he sat down, we talked small talk. And then he said, now I wonder what the plan is. And of course, I couldn't tell him. But in fact, he'd worked out from first principles. He said, well, the ground here is not so good for tanks, but if you go that way, and then he said, and of course, the division isn't where everybody's telling me it is. It's actually slightly further west. So he had the whole thing worked out, but I couldn't say a word. And we laugh about it now. And then, as you know, the ground war started, and we, in the headquarters, we quickly lost any idea of what was going on. It was just impossible to keep up with what was happening. And it was difficult enough for the units on the ground to know exactly where everybody was. And we were in the headquarters, we were trying to not only work out what the United Kingdom armored division was doing, but also what the American armored and infantry divisions were doing, what their Marine Corps was doing, what the French division was doing. And the French division just disappeared, I mean, into the desert. We never heard of them again. And also there was the joint Arab force, I can't remember what it's called, Joint Force North or something. And we would never get any feedback. So for the period of the ground war, everything became very, very vague. The UK division had to pass across the Iraqi border through a breach in the minefields made by the American 1st Infantry Division, called the Big Red One. But the 3rd Brigade of the US division was slow to make the transit for reasons that I never understood, and which held up the United Kingdom division because they couldn't go through. And we were bombarded with phone calls back from back in the UK, from the joint headquarters there, asking us what was wrong with our division and why weren't they being a bit quicker. But eventually it did pass through and attacked into northern Kuwait. The ground assault, as you will well know, was actually a walkover, really. And the Iraqi army just wasn't up to it. It just wasn't in the same league as the Americans or the coalition forces. And it led to those dreadful scenes like the highway of death, the highway from Kuwait City going north to Basra, where all the Iraqi vehicles were caught and destroyed by air. And that's the first time that we began to have doubts about the morality of continuing attacking a defeated enemy, which is an interesting sort of thing that we could maybe talk about again. In the aftermath of all this, we were all absolutely desperate to get home. Now, I had only been out really about 2.5 months. But other people had been there for 6 months. And so we were all desperate to get home at the end. And I, almost immediately after the war ended, hostilities ended at 8 a.m. in the morning on the 28th of February, 1991. I went up to, I flew up to Kuwait and to the headquarters of the 1st UK Division, which was then had come to rest just north of Kuwait City. And I have to say that flying into Kuwait, it was just a scene of utter devastation. It was one huge refuse dump. Everything had been looted and all the oil wells were burning. And there was no sense at all of victory or glory or it being wonderful. It was just extremely very sad. I visited the division and then I flew out again to go back to Riyadh. In a Royal New Zealand Air Force Hercules, that was their contribution to the coalition forces. And on the way out from Kuwait through the burning oil wells, the aircraft, after about 10 minutes, had started to maneuver really strangely and do all sorts of turns and banks that a straightforward transit didn't necessitate. Anyway, it transpired that at that point in the flight, the aircraft was being flown by the pilot's girlfriend, who had just come along for the ride. And so she'd been given a turn at the controls and was being instructed how to turn it this way and that way. But we were all so tired, we didn't really mind at all. And that was that. And thereafter, when I got back to Riyadh, there was a roster for going home, and people were terribly kind to me because I'd been recently married, and representations were put up to those deciding who goes home first. And I got one of the first flights back to Germany, which was very welcome because I'd had enough by that point. So really, that's the story of my war in outline. Just a few sort of reflective points, perhaps, before we sort of stop and I can pick up on anything that people would like to know about more. The first thing I asked myself sometime afterwards was it actually worth it? And the answer I came back to after deliberation was no, it wasn't really worth it, actually. It wasn't worth all the misery and the destruction and the death. And it had seemed in retrospect that it had been a huge effort to overcome an enemy which wasn't particularly dangerous. So as we say over here, we'd taken a bit of a hammer to crack a nut, and that we might have been able to do it much more economically and efficiently. There had been an overestimation of Iraqi military capabilities. And most of the intelligence came from the United States resources. And I sometimes wonder whether that was deliberate because the US obviously the military needed the support of the government. And if they painted a less than fearsome enemy, which the Iraqi army or the Iraqi military was very definitely not fearsome, then perhaps they'd have lost political support. So I think the Americans overpainted the danger in order to maintain their political support back home. The other thing I was very dismayed about was the disproportionate casualty rates between the opposing sides. I mean, any casualties are regrettable, but when you're looking at maybe the coalition having 200, 250 casualties, and estimates for the Iraqi casualties being up to 100,000, then something is very wrong morally, I thought. And I often used to say that if Kuwait's main export had been carrots instead of oil, would we have actually bothered at all? And I think the answer is probably not. No, we wouldn't. So I wasn't the only one who questioned the morality of the whole operation. I think it was very clear that from the United States point of view, they were laying the ghost of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, they had lost and had more casualties than they'd had in any other war, I think, in terms of dead. And their military was on a downer after the Vietnam War, and they needed desperately some success to put military morale right. And so they were absolutely determined that come hell or high water, the Iraqi war, the first Gulf War, would be successful. And they put huge resources into ensuring that would be the case. As for me, it made peacetime soldiering very ordinary afterwards, because having been to war, and I think if you speak to anybody who's been on military operations, whether it be flying aircraft during the Second World War or being in the Falklands from the British point of view, or being in the Korean War, everything after that in the military tends to sort of pale by comparison. And it's no accident that after major conflicts, that quite a number of servicemen and women leave the service and go back to civilian life. And the only other benefit I got out of it really was that, as Rosa said in the introduction, it allowed me to write my little diary, which I've got a copy of here. And in case you think this is a blatant and shameless attempt to sell copies of my book, you can't buy it because this is the last one and it's out of print. But it gave me the opportunity to do that, which I very much enjoyed because I'd always wanted to publish a book, and that was my opportunity. Rosa, I think that's all I've got to say. I think that's taken up the better part of 45 minutes. So I've sort of stuck to remit, if you like. Perfect. And is there anything you want me to expand upon or say again or say slower? Or
first of all, thank you so much, because at least for me, and I'm sure for all the audience, it was not only enlightening but entertaining, because at least for me, like I had a whole different perspective. So for sure, like it shed light into my understanding of the Gulf War, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, we have some questions here. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you guys want, you can just write your questions on the chat, and then I'm gonna read them out loud. So you feel free to write them either in Catalan or in English. We have two so far. One is, could you comment on the command structure of the coalition, especially between the Joint Command Gulf Forces and the Commander British Forces Middle East?
Okay.
Do you want me to read the second one, or?
No, I'll take them one at a time, Rosa, if that's all right.
Perfect.
The command structure, in terms of the overall command structure, the Americans were in charge, and I think it was General Norman Schwarzkopf and US CENTCOM, their Central Europe Command. But the main players, as far as we were concerned, were 7 US Corps, under which command the UK Armoured Division came. And I think also the Joint Forces Command North came under that as well, the Arabic forces and the French. So we were under command 7 US Corps, and further to the east, south of Kuwait and on the coast, I think one of the US Marine Corps was an overall command for that. In terms of the presence of the headquarters British Forces in the Middle East, we were a national command. We weren't in the operational chain of command. So General Sir Peter de la Billière, who was my boss at the time, was not directing the UK troops on the ground how they should approach the operation or giving them orders. That was done through the American chain of command. We were basically there as a national representative command. I think we had a veto. I think that General Sir Peter could have said, no, we're not going to do that. But we were very much representing an organization called Permanent Joint Headquarters, which is just outside London in the UK, where all the British military expeditionary operations are controlled. So, for example, the Falklands, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, I think as well was also. So we weren't in the chain of command as one would normally understand it. We were there as a sort of national overwatch, and I think we had a veto, but I couldn't be sure on that. Does that answer it?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. We have another one. Nuria is asking, who were the real commanders in chief in operations? She says, like, the same as draw up the plans. And what was the Iraqi army like from your perspective? And a third question, do you think Saddam decided to go ahead with his a priori crazy plans?
Right, okay, who are the commanders? Well, the commander of as far as we were concerned, the UK Armoured Division, was General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the CENTCOM commander. I can't remember who the US Corps commander was, so he would be the next one down the operational chain of command. Our commanding officer in the field commanded one UK Armoured Division, was a guy called Major General Rupert Smith. Now, interestingly, although he commanded an armoured division, he was a parachute regiment soldier, so much more used to light operations. I have to say that he was the most delightfully easy person to work with. He was also, and I always remember my wife saying that he was also remarkably handsome, which may or may not have influenced her opinion of him. And then we had two maneuver brigades. So the 4th Armoured Brigade was commanded by a chap called Brigadier Christopher Hammerbeck, who was actually of my regiment. So he had served with 4th Tanks before he was promoted to higher level. And the 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats, was commanded by Brigadier Patrick Cordingley. And there was also an artillery brigade, but I'm afraid I don't know who did that. So that's commanders. What was the second part of the question? Was it the Iraqi army?
Yes, let me find it again. What was the Iraqi army like from your perspective?
Well, I of course didn't actually physically fight against them, but lots of my friends were in the various tank regiments that did the British attack into northern Kuwait. And the truth of the matter is that, and I think I say this somewhere in my book, the Iraqi army was, and I don't mean to be in any way denigrate the people, because they were obviously brave, but they were dressed up in first world equipment, but in fact their training and morale and their generalship was very poor. They were incapable of, as far as we could see, of mounting what I would call a combined arms operation. In other words, integrating artillery and air and logistics and infantry and tanks in any sort of military operation. They didn't have that. They fought separately, and of course they had no night vision equipment, and almost all of the coalition attacks and advances were done at night because we had thermal imaging. So it was a very, I mean, war is not fair. I mean, and you know, you don't get prizes in war for fighting fairly. You fight to win. And but it was a bit like, it was almost like a colonial war, where one side has spears and shields and the other side has machine guns. So you know, there's no secret that I was bothered by the morality of it. There's no secret I was bothered about that, but that's what happened.
Yeah. She asked another question, like, what do you think about why Saddam decided to go ahead with this plan?
Well, I think because he thought the coalition was bluffing. He thought that there is no way that the Americans and their allies are going to bring a huge expeditionary force to the Middle East and to counter what I'm doing. I can do. And the Iraqis, remember, had a huge army in paper. Mm-hmm. And I think it was quite clear that if their occupation of Kuwait had not resulted in some response from the US coalition, then they very much might have decided to go into Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi government was terrified of this happening, and rightly so, because they wouldn't have, the Saudis militarily, I mean, mm-hmm. you know, I mean, I don't want to be rude, but yeah. it just wouldn't happen. So I think that he probably, and we'll never know really, thought that he would get away with it. And just like all aggressors, they thought, well, here's an opportunity. I don't think anyone's going to resist. I'll call their bluff and see how I get on.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. We have more questions coming in.
Cool.
So our friend Geoffrey is asking, do you think that the war could have been won with air forces alone?
Ah, good question.
Yeah, and if so, why do you think that the popular memory of the war is centered on tanks? At least this says.
Right. Okay. Could this the question about whether wars can be won by air power alone is almost as old as the question as the invention of powered flight and its adaptation to warlike purposes. And it's one of the recurring questions which are discussed usually when military budgets in countries are being discussed. There's a bit of a sort of fight between the Navy and the Air Force and the Army as to who should get the best allocation of funding. And the Air Force will always say, well, we can do this on our own. The answer is that in the first Gulf War, it might well have been possible for the war to have been won by air power alone. Certainly in terms of destroying the Iraqi military infrastructure, that might well have been possible. But war is not just about destruction. It's about persuading your enemy that they shouldn't be fighting anymore, to win the moral war. And sometimes to do that, you have to have soldiers on the ground who will take and hold on to territory. And you can't do that from the air. You can't hold ground from the air. You can influence what happens on the ground from the air, but you cannot hold ground from there. In my estimation, there may be others who disagree with that. Why tanks? Well, I think that that in many ways we'd been preparing for so many years during the Cold War in Western Europe to fight the Soviet invasion, which never came, of course. And we had huge arsenals of tanks and armored vehicles. And I think that this was seen as the vindication of that doctrine, in that huge fleets of tanks and other armored vehicles were still relevant in the modern war, in modern conflict. And of course, there were a lot out there. There were thousands of tanks out there. The debate nowadays, of course, is that, and you will know, or people listening will know from recent conflicts, particularly the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, that the whole question of the survivability of tanks in the battlefield has been called into question because of the proliferation of drones, armed drones, loitering munitions, and unmanned aerial vehicles. So the pendulum always swings one way and the other. And I think it would be a brave person who said, well, the tanks are now obsolete and we shouldn't use them anymore. Because I don't think that debate has been concluded yet. But I also remember that only 100 years ago, people were still saying that there would always be a place in the battlefield for the well-bred horse, which Field Marshal Lord Haig said at the end of during the First World War. So that's what I think. I don't think the tank has had its day. I think it just has to adapt to new sophisticated threats.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah, this was a question that I also had myself. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Now we have Colonel Dorcha Lee that he would like to make some remarks. So if my colleague Danny can put him on video on speaker, maybe he could talk.
Nice to see you, Dorcha.
Okay, hi Stuart. First of all, one nix a totem per Irlanda. Great to see so many familiar names across there, and all my friends in SEM. Societat, Militars, and of course, Stuart, absolutely fascinating, totally, completely hanging in every word you said. In fact, your last couple of comments did answer a few comments I was going to make. On the question of the morality of the war, I could reassure you very much that the target country was Saudi Arabia. And in other words, it was a very, very complex Iraqi operation. They went in, but were they going to stay or not? And I was kind of a witness to the invasion itself back in August the 2nd of the 90. And when the entire Iraqi army went in past the UN team site, which I was in command, and it took 6 weeks for them to get in along one road, 300,000 approximately troops, a lot of very, very obsolete equipment, some state-of-the-art stuff, which the Republican Guard had and whatever. But as a tank officer, you don't drive tanks, of course, from Iraq all the way to Kuwait City. You bring them in on tank transporters, you take them off, and then they go to action. So, but we noticed that the tanks were all brought in on tank transporters. And then the tank transporters came back a few hours later, looting, with looted stuff from Kuwait on a fantastic scale, a scale we never imagined. Traffic lights, all the armored cars of the Kuwaiti army and gendarmerie, everything you could imagine, school furniture, just unbelievable, constant streams of stuff. And of course, what do you call it, air conditioners. And outside Basra, they set up a massive 24-hour market and flogged all the non-military hardware. But so the question is, what was the intent to stay or not? But they definitely would have gone into Saudi Arabia. And the other thing is that there was no way Saddam was going to move unless the strong action that was taken was taken. Now, in my view, and this may be a failure of the UN really, but when the invasion happened, there was an opportunity which lasted for several weeks to stop the invasion by air attack alone. The area that I was at, there was one bridge alone. If that was brought down, the Iraqis simply could not have continued their onward advance with all their stuff. It didn't happen. Why a UN resolution was passed, I don't know. I didn't follow it up afterwards, but certainly if the international community, perhaps the Russians used their veto, I don't know, but it was inexplicable that there was no immediate reaction. There's many side stories on that. The day of the tank, of the recent conflict in Armenia, I agree very much with you. You know, war is a strange thing. It's the weapon that you start out with. You don't realize which is the one that's going to make a decision. But the drone changed that war. You know, the Azeris won it, which was not expected because the Russians were backing the Armenians. We could say that in the Falklands War, that had the Argentine Air Force got more Exocet missiles, which were on order, the outcome could have been different. It is a very unpredictable thing. So no matter all the resources that go in, you don't know what the outcome is. But it's a tough part of the world to be deployed, Stuart. It's very, very hot. The hottest experience is 54 degrees centigrade on the Shatt al-Arab and down that direction. These are unbelievable temperatures and hard to be just brought out and put straight into that. In our case, we were a whole year there acclimatizing, really. But what I would say is that I hope, though, that the members of the society will, and I'm sure they do, appreciate the personal experience that you had that was there from beginning to end. And you're quite right not to have a script. Because when you talk for the heart like that, you're a good storyteller. There were so many images that came up which I can recognize, identify with, you know. And but that's the way it was. I mean, I feel a certain sadness for the Iraqi military. You summarize the situation. That was the consequence of taking on formidable forces, and it's there's so much arising out of it. When it was over, our crowd stepped back in again, the UN observers, and there was a new mission, which is the Iraq-Kuwait mission. There's a lot more to that, but it's over, and Saddam Hussein is gone. There were a lot of questions after why they didn't pursue it all the way to Baghdad. But Western governments, certain Western governments, I won't name them, were beholden very much to Iraq. They needed the oil from Iraq to pay debts that Iraq owed them. So if a central government of Iraq disappeared, that wouldn't have happened. So the idea of Iraq breaking up at that stage, after you had gone back, that was a non-starter. And in a way, in the long run, perhaps that was the way it was. But I just wanted to say, it's great to see you again. And thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to be present. And so I'll say no more, but just great night. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dorcha. Thanks, Dorcha.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Perfect. We have more coming in.
Oh, good.
So Oriol is asking that you commented on the problems in supply and to adapt some of the vehicles in the desert.
Yes.
And that you had to ask for help to South Africa. So was this like a surprise, like this deployment, or how was the perspective?
Well, I mean, I think there's two aspects to that. I don't think that certainly the British military had been preparing to fight in the Middle East or a desert environment. Although, and tonight's probably not the time to talk about it, the British have a strange affinity with deserts and desert warfare, which stretches all the way back to Lawrence of Arabia, and strange things happen to the British military when they go into a desert environment. It's not as if normal practices and discipline goes out the window. But I remember when I went to see General Rupert Smith in the divisional headquarters, there was a sentry standing outside his tent. Sorry, I'm going off at a tangent now. I hope you don't mind. And the sentry was wearing an American hat, desert hat, a Saudi pink shamag around his neck, a British desert combat jacket, American temperate color, green and brown combat trousers, and a pair of civilian shoes. And that's what happens to the British when they go into the desert to go to war. If you look at the the history of the Second World War in North Africa, when the armored regiments went out and everybody, General Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, one of our more famous army officers, you know, they wore civilian V-neck jerseys and corduroy trousers and suede shoes. That's what happens to the British when they go to the desert, and it's something. We used to say in the days before it became non-politically correct, we go native, but we can't say that anymore, so I won't say it. But anyway, so the answer is no, we didn't think we were going to fight the next war in the desert. We'd been preparing to fight the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact in Germany. The thing that surprised me, which I mentioned in my little presentation, was that we had been issued with equipment and trained on it, which had been deemed up to that point adequate to take on the combined shock armies of the Warsaw Pact. And then yet when we went to Iraq to fight against a much less fearsome and competent enemy, it was suddenly decided that our equipment wasn't good enough and that we had to up armor the tanks, we had to put on additional armor, we had to have this, we had to have that, fuel. And I always remember thinking, well, I mean, were we kidding ourselves that we could do it with the equipment we had in Germany? Now, I was in a Chieftain tank regiment, and Chieftain was notoriously unreliable with its engine. But I had absolute confidence in the tank, and more importantly, in the training of the crews. The weakest point in an armored fighting vehicle in terms of a tank is crew, because if you've got a well-trained crew, then you have superiority over less well-trained crews who may have superior equipment. And that's a fairly long-winded answer to a straightforward question. But no, we didn't expect to go. I mean, that's why we all turned up in European uniform. And the funny thing, this is just shows you how stupid war is, that we didn't have any desert combat uniforms because we'd sold them all to the Iraqis.
Wow.
There's no sense to it.
Right. Wow.
War is senseless. Anyway.
Well, thank you. We have many more questions. I'm just going to read them to you.
I've got all night. I can stay as long as you like.
So Bernat is asking, regarding the comment about staggering difference in outcomes, so 250 casualties on the coalition versus the 100,000 Iraqi side, would you consider the ultimate reason of this overwhelming display of force was to protect as much as possible the infrastructures of the area so as to resume oil export as soon as possible?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, no, I think the answer is is twofold. First of all, that the coalition forces were immensely, hugely more competent than the Iraqi forces. And I said before that I used the example of the fact that the Iraqis had no night vision equipment. Now I know because I had lots of my young officers who I'd trained with the previous year had volunteered to go out there and serve with other regiments as tank commanders. And they did all their attacks at night. And they were firing on the Iraqi armored vehicles and tanks, and the Iraqis didn't even know they were there. So it was so one-sided. And that was exacerbated by the fact that the coalition, after the first 2 days, had complete and utter control of the air. All the Iraqi anti-aircraft batteries had been taken out or destroyed. All the radars were gone. All the communication centers were destroyed. All the aircraft had either been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or had fled to Iran. And quite a lot of Iraqi aircraft fled to Iran, which not many people have ever commented upon, but they were welcomed and interned in Iran. And so the huge disparity in casualties, which I find morally troubling, as I've said before, was due to the fact that it was an unequal contest. And I don't think it had anything to do with preserving any infrastructure anywhere, because all the bridges in Baghdad were knocked down. And the other thing that I also spoke about, which troubled me and still troubles me, is the fact that the coalition continued to attack and destroy an enemy which was so clearly beaten. Yeah. And I thought we should have stopped earlier, but that's not an issue.
No,
does that answer it? Is that the answer?
Yeah, like that. Like this is like total different perspective from what was like portrayed into media and like.
Yeah. No, it was. I mean, we had in the headquarters of the British forces in Riyadh, we had discussions about the morality of continuing to attack the Iraqis, and people were really troubled about it. Really, really troubled.
Right. So, like a question that is like along those lines, Oriol is asking, what was the opinion amongst the Scottish society on the war?
Oh, good. Well, good. I mean, there's a good question. Well, in my immediate Scottish society, which was my regiment, then it was a case of, well, you know, if that's where we've got to go, that's where we've got to go. But my regiment didn't deploy as a unit; it deployed as individuals. In Scottish society, I can remember when I got my posting saying you're going to the Gulf. I phoned my mother in Glasgow, and because I was in Germany and she was back in Glasgow, Scotland, and I said, "Hi, Mum, I'm going off to the war in the Gulf," and I always remember she said, "Well, you can't be a member of the organisation in peacetime without accepting the fact that you're going to have to be in the organisation in wartime."
Right.
And she had lived through the Second World War, so and you know, her brother had gone off to Burma, and I thought, well, that's a fair enough comment. Scottish society, there is an element nowadays in Scottish society, and you will know, Rosa, I think that that I comment quite a lot about military aspects of the Scottish independence movement and nuclear weapons and all that sort of nonsense, which we don't have time for tonight. But there is although Scotland has contributed more than its fair share to previous military adventures, if you want to put that, from Britain and the British Empire. In more recent years, there is a sort of incipient anti-militarism, particularly within the Scottish National Party, of which I've been a member, and to whom I still speak about military matters. But I would say that at the moment, Scottish society is not comfortable with its relationship with the military, partly because the military is seen as being a symbol of the United Kingdom and not the symbol of an independent Scotland.
Right.
Yet.
Yeah. As much as I don't like to draw parallelisms, I think that in Catalonia it happens like part of the same thing. So I think this is why it's so great that you speak like with such like naturality like about military stuff, because I think it's important to encourage debate in military.
Yeah, I think if you come from a sort of anti-militaristic background, and there's nothing wrong with that politically, because nothing wrong at all. I think that you might, if you're from that background, you might think about the military as being the sort of the tool of government for aggression and invasion and oppression and all that sort of stuff. But the truth of the matter, from my perspective, is that certainly in the UK, I mean, we do get involved in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Sierra Leone and the Falklands, but we also get involved to a huge extent when there's the COVID pandemic. Right. You know, the military is called out to set up the vaccination centres, because because the military is quite good at that stuff. You know, they're quite good at being asked, you know, can you set up a vaccination centre that will take 2,000 people a day in the car park outside Edinburgh? The answer is yes, we can do that stuff.
Totally, yeah.
So I think I prefer to think of the military as being an asset to the civilian community, which unfortunately from time to time has to go into conflict.
Sorry. Yeah, so we have one last question.
Yeah.
Which I actually think is an interesting one. Ricard is asking, why do you think that Allied forces did not arrive to Baghdad when they could have achieved the target, and Iraqi forces completely lost control? And I think this is quite interesting. I had my question myself also, because it was portrayed that the coalition did achieve such a immediate strategic victory. And at the same time, one could interpret victory as being something that the ruler is still in power. So no matter how much destruction or how much people have been killed, the ruler was still in power. So from your perspective, what was your opinion on this? Why did not get Saddam Hussein, or how did you leave that from your perspective?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's one which people have pondered ever since, because it's quite clear that had the coalition attack continued, it would have easily been able to capture Baghdad and the rest of Iraq easily. I mean, there was no resistance at that point whatsoever. I think two reasons. I think that the US President George Bush got cold feet for reasons that I don't understand. He thought that he might lose support, I think, internationally if they continued to Baghdad. Although, to be honest, we would have been in Baghdad so quickly because there was no opposition that he could have got away with that. But also remember, there was this sort of surge in people in theatre who were concerned about the morality of it. And I don't want to sort of overplay that, but I mean, we were really concerned about the morality of it. And one of the things that concerned me and other people was that immediately after the war, the coalition powers and other nations around organized a military equipment exhibition in Bahrain. And the thing that annoyed me was that an awful lot of the military industrial complex was keen to have that just after the war, so they could market their weapon systems with the stamp "combat proven" on them, which I thought was immoral, actually, and I had no part in setting the exhibition up. So certainly Saddam Hussein could have been toppled. It may well have been that if Saddam and the Ba'athist party had toppled, it would have left a vacuum, which would have led to chaos. And arguably, that's what happened in the Second Gulf War in 2003, because there was no plan to set up an infrastructure. And one of the interesting things that I always remember from just reading about the Second World War was that when the Allies liberated what is now Vietnam, which had been Dutch, whatever it was called, Dutch Vietnam, and the Japanese forces surrendered and laid down their weapons. Within 24 hours, they were rearmed and became the police force. Because you've got to have an infrastructure in place. Otherwise, it becomes open to organized crime, to militias, to gangsterism, to exploitation. It becomes lawless. And I think that that might or might not have put George Bush off in 1991. It's certainly what happened in 2003, because Iraq became chaotic.
Right.
Because there was no replacement for the Ba'athist party.
Right. But in a sense, I think also that like portraying the war in such like a great victory. I think this also could have encouraged policymakers in 2003 to invade. So at the same time, what stopped them from doing this, I think it's like a cycle. So it also encouraged them to invade, since like they clearly like sold it as a clear victory in.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was very much a clear victory. It just wasn't an absolute victory as it might have been had it continued for another week. But I think politicians are always very conscious of their sort of political support base at home. And I think people were beginning to think, well, and also just from a purely selfish point of view, the Americans and the Brits and other people would have said, well, let's not continue this anymore. Let's not get any more of our people killed when it's so obviously we've won.
Right.
So, you know, and there's nothing sadder than someone who loses their life on the last day of the war, you know, an hour before ceasefire. Although, if you look at it sort of sensibly, that's bound to happen, however.
Great. Perfect. I don't know if you have like any last remarks that you would like to make or that you would like to say.
No, I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously I have no book to sell because it's out of print. So you can make it. In actual fact, I just because it's a private publishing, and I only had 200 or 250 copies made, and I sold some and I gave some away, and then the last few I had, some of my former soldiers got in touch with me in social media, said, can we buy one of your books? And I said, no, you can't buy it, I'll send you one. But if you want to make a donation to my regimental benevolent fund, the charity, then I'll leave that entirely up to you. So that's what happens. That's where they all went. And there are one or two sort of secondhand copies in circulation. So I went onto Amazon and just rather sort of egocentrically just typed in the title of the book and see it. And you can buy one for £600. Now,
I can even see the option. I was checking it before and I could see that.
Yeah. Don't buy this book for £600. It's not worth it.
I mean,
it's not worth it. But no, I mean, but it's been great fun talking to you, and you know, it's obviously one of the things that I did, and it was probably in many ways, in terms of military career, it was a sort of culmination point, and everything afterwards became less important, I think. But and the only reason I remember it so well is because purely by chance, I was keeping a personal diary at the time. I didn't keep a diary because I went to war. I was actually keeping one at the time, and I only did it for about 2.5 years. And it just so happened that it coincided with the war. So I've got all the records, and I've got all my original handwritten notes and all that sort of stuff. And I could write 500,000 words on it, but then no one would read it, and it's a big job. But if anyone wants any more detail, I'm doing that sort of autobiographical series of episodes online on the thinkscotland.org site. And the last 4 or 5 episodes have been to do with the first Gulf War. So there's a wee bit more on there if people are interested.
Perfect.
Thinkscotland.org under the culture button for some unknown reason. But yeah, so we'll there you go. But I'm absolutely delighted and flattered to be asked to speak, actually.
No, it's such a pleasure for us. Thank you so much for being here.
Not at all. And am I allowed to say that I look forward to coming out to Barcelona in
for sure.
Later in the year?
Yeah.
For the for other things to do with the defense of small independent nations.
Great. We'll be waiting for you. Thank you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rosa. You've been great.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Moltíssimes gràcies a tothom, els que heu assistit, i res, bona nit i moltes gràcies, perquè al final és els que sou els que doneu sentit a trobades i als actes com avui. Doncs res, bona nit, adeu. Bye, see you.
Bye.
You're saying thank you in the chat. Just, yeah, many people said thank you, and yeah.